Good afternoon to everyone, and welcome to this third session of the day on the nexus between environment and democracy. We've had two sessions already during the day in which we have focused on big international negotiations and diplomacy, and also on development-related issues. In this third session, we will delve into the very complex relationship between environment and democracy policies. A lot has been written over the years on the kind of aggregate relationship between climate and democracies, but there are lots of ways in which this relationship is evolving, is changing fast, and many nuances to examine, in particular in terms of the more precise links between environment and democracy policies on the ground. So in this session, we will examine these kinds of issues and also take the opportunity to showcase some of the research that the Westminster Foundation has been supporting on its environmental democracy approach. We have four extremely well qualified speakers who have been reflecting and working on these issues to take us through the next 90 minutes. We will start with Carol Excel, who's director of the World Resources Institute, who has a very rich experience in defending environmental activists. So she works at precisely the point where the democracy and environment agendas meet most clearly in practice. She's going to tell us this afternoon about several strands of work within the WRI that are centered precisely on this nexus between environment and democratic rights. We'll then hear from Daniel Lindvall, who's an academic expert at Uppsala University, also rich experience working with the Swedish government. Daniel is author of one of the most thorough recent papers I've seen on the climate democracy nexus, published recently with International IDEA. This paper brings out some of the nuances in this relationship between climate action and democracy, but it also usefully leads through the empirical research to Daniel's thoughts on how environment and democracy programming can and should be combined to greater effect in the future. So we'll hear from Daniel setting out his stall as our second speaker, before then moving on to Alina Avrakanchova, who is Distinguished Policy Fellow at the LSE's Grantham Institute on Climate Change and Environment. And significantly, this is where she has been leading the Westminster Foundation's supported research that is looking at assessing climate and environmental crisis through better governance, the title of her research project. And in particular, looking at the challenge of joining together the environmental democracy approach within practical development cooperation policies. So Alina will run us through some of her reflections on this issue. And then finally, we will hear from Evan Lieberman, Professor Lieberman, who's a professor at MIT, long history of work on Africa. And Evan will wrap up for us by zooming out a little bit and reflecting on some of the more political challenges and obstacles that we face in combining environmental and democracy policies in practice, and perhaps with a few suggestions of where research analysis can actually contribute to bringing these two such important areas of policy together. So that lays out how we will run the next 90 minutes. I remind people they can submit questions, also tweet under the hashtag #OurPlanetNeedsDemocracy. As we are relatively short of time, I will stop there and hand the floor straight over to Carol to kick us off.
Thank you so much for that introduction. And it's really my pleasure to be here today to talk a little bit about the work that we're doing that looks at the intersection of environment and democracy. And I wanted to start off with what grounded our work, the work of the World Resources Institute in this field for so many years, which is Principle 10 of the Rio Declaration, of course, which was adopted in 1992. It says quite clearly that environmental issues are best handled with the participation of all concerned citizens at the relevant level. At the national level, each individual shall have appropriate access to information concerning the environment that is held by public authorities, including information on hazardous materials and activities in their communities, and the opportunity to participate in decision-making processes, and that states shall facilitate and encourage public awareness and participation by making information widely available. Effective access to judicial and administrative proceedings, including redress and remedy, shall be provided. And I start there because Principle 10 really grounded the work of the World Resources Institute and our partners to work on environmental democracy from 1999, when we started work specifically on supporting, building a movement to fight for environmental democracy. And we really saw ourselves at that time partnering with civil society to really talk about creating an environmental democracy world. And maybe it was a bit naive that we thought that only through working jointly and supportively with civil society would we be able to do that. But we really focused on trying to create a network at that time of civil society organizations in over 60 countries around the world, to really be able to understand what that principle meant and how that could be translated into the context of the environmental issues that were being faced by people all over the world, whether it was climate, forests, mining, biodiversity, whatever work that we're doing, we thought that this principle could be incorporated into the decision-making process of governments and really shepherd in creating power for people to be able to influence decisions that impacted the quality of the environment that they lived in and their lives, that, really ensuring that people would be consulted with and would be able to hold accountable those who were damaging the environment or developing unsustainably and even social unjust decisions. And so our belief was that environmental democracy at that time, and I still think to this day, we still hold this belief, that with these rights, the rights of information, participation, and access to justice, the public is empowered in a way that it wouldn't otherwise be. To stay informed about natural resource development issues, to monitor governments and corporate performance, to participate in and influence decisions that impact the environment, to advocate for changes in policies and practices, and even demand compensation and relief in the case of environmental harm. So that has been some of why and how we have done work and how we've perceived this issue of environmental democracy. And we recognized in 1999, when we started this work, that we couldn't do it alone, and that we needed to bring civil society and government together around that principle and really ensure that people, no matter their economic or social economic status, would have both laws that underscored these rights to information, participation, and access to justice, and that we could build the capacity of governments to implement these ideas into institutions and into practice. To ensure that there would be more accountability for both governments and corporations in their decision. Over the years, I think the understanding of how this space of environmental democracy works has shifted, and so has our focus shifted in trying to see if we can really ensure that this principle becomes real to people and is part of their lives. And I think what has been clear to us, that this journey, that it's not good enough to, of course, create ways of monitoring and measuring environmental democracy alone won't help us reach there, although it's a very important step. But it really is about creating coalitions and change agents on the ground, both in government and civil society, to make it happen. So part of our journey in working on environmental democracy at the World Resources Institute has really been about monitoring and measuring through indicators whether laws and practices have changed over time, and whether we can see progress in both the outcome of decision-making, and we can see changes in terms of accountability. And I'd like to say that I think we have. We've been really lucky to be able to see people using these rights in new spaces that we had never thought would be possible, in pushing for the adoption of new laws and practices, in using the court system to get remedy over the last 20 years. And measuring has been really important aspect of furthering the practice of environmental democracy, not just seeing whether the laws exist, but really understanding the breadth of their coverage across different decision-making processes, whether barriers and constraints to people fulfilling these rights have actually worked, whether they can be removed, and whether or not people can actually participate in new ways to challenge the effectiveness of government in achieving environmental goals. So I would like to say that even in this journey, we've recognized a lot in that approach. And I think some of the greatest realizations that we've had over the last couple of years has been that there actually needs to be more than work at the national level. We have not seen that governments and civil society have actually ensured the achievement of environmental democracy without bringing new partnerships to bear. And I think the Aarhus Convention, of course, is a good example of actually seeing a global agreement that has really pushed countries, mostly in Europe, to really institutionalize practices of environmental democracy and look to ensure their realization. And for us, a big realization for us was the need to do that as well in other parts of the world. And so the work of WRI with its partners in the Access Initiative has focused for quite a long time now, over 10 years, to push for regional frameworks in the passage of laws and practices, particularly in the Latin America and Caribbean region, to develop the Eskuzu agreement, to bring countries together to look at what we have caused or often speak of as that implementation gap, even where you have laws in countries all over the world, and even institutions that are required to implement these laws. We found that the gap between what the law and policy says and what practice and what happens to people on the ground still remains very large. And even with capacity building programs, there are other institutions, other barriers that actually prevent people from being able to use these rights effectively for specific reasons. And we have been exploring, because of this, looking at how this has changed, looking at different sectors. So for example, mining sector, forestry sector, or even in climate, we've seen different ways in which governments have pushed back against the realization of environmental democracy in different countries. And so that we've really focused on creating a theory of change that looks at how we can bring governments together to reinforce mechanisms for compliance and capacity building as one of the tools in which we hope will ensure the realization of these rights. The other areas that were mentioned even by in my introduction is this issue of the understanding of the link between access rights and the right to protest and freedom of speech, and having safe spaces for environmental human rights defenders to utilize their rights to free speech or to protest, and how access rights, or these rights to information, public participation, and access to justice link to these rights of freedom of speech and freedom of protest. And there needs to be continued work in this area, because in our own work that we've looked at, we see how the lack of these rights, the lack of environmental democracy, actually puts at risk environmental and land defenders, and makes and acerbates conflicts that could otherwise have been addressed with other means. And so in that area in particular, I think there is more need to really understand how conflicts actually get worse when we fail to implement these rights and fail to provide safe spaces for people, even within countries that require spaces to participate. If they're not safe spaces, they actually can cause harm to persons who are willing to speak up. The other issues I would mention just briefly is this issue of lack of corporate accountability. And using access rights, or using rights to information, participation, and justice to achieve corporate accountability. We have found in many countries that there's no direct link between having these rights to ensure corporate accountability in all cases. They can facilitate and create an environment in which people have new means of power to actually drive corporate accountability, but there are so many barriers to their achievement in many countries, whether it's barriers to accessing information in a timely way, appeals process, abilities to actually use spaces for public participation that are not already so influenced by corporations that they actually restrain people's ability to influence government decisions, and then of course access to justice, where in courts there are very many difficulties to go up against large corporations who have millions of dollars up on the line, and governments not seeing, creating a balance in power in addressing the needs of local communities or local citizens who are trying to either stop projects or influence development. The last thing I would like to mention in this area that I think needs to be more focused on is this issue of vulnerable groups. Of course, we realize that many may have access rights, may have rights to information, public participation, or access to justice, but the most vulnerable people, those people often have difficulty in fully exercising these rights because of circumstances or conditions in their national context. And it's often very, very difficult and challenging all over the globe still for governments to actually institute procedures and processes to ensure that the most vulnerable are heard and that the power structures actually can be shifted to hear their needs. I'd like to just mention lastly where some of our work has been headed. Clearly in Africa, we have a huge focus now on Africa. We've found that Africa as a continent, many countries, even though they have rights recognized in their constitution and may have rights to information laws, even provisions on public participation, institutionalized in their constitutions, actually implementation of these laws in practice really lags behind. Protection of defenders as well lags behind many other countries and regions, and access to justice through courts and other mechanisms also lags behind in many areas. And so that there needs to be more focus on how to ensure implementation of these rights in Africa and how to ensure perhaps also consideration of a regional approach. We recently launched just in January a report that looks at the Democratic Republic of Congo, Ghana, Kenya, and South Africa, and provides some initial evaluation and preliminary steps to consider how to go about this. And we think it should be a huge focus of work going forward. Another tool that we have also looked at to try and address this implementation gap is a new tool that we focus on in the climate space. It's a political economy guide that looks to unpack the political economy of climate governance and really tries to understand what structures, rules, norms, interests, or groups could be entry points to allow civil society to focus their advocacy, capacity building, and coalition building to create change, because we know already that without thinking politically, we don't think access rights can alone of themselves create that change. And lastly, a new area that we are focusing on is also on supporting the implementation of the Eskuzu agreement, supporting countries that are looking to accede or ratify the agreement, how to ensure that they can examine their laws and practices to reform them, to ensure that they can actually meet the standards in the Eskuzu agreement, which are some of the most interesting and strongest standards that relate to vulnerable groups and the provision of access rights that currently exist. So I'll just end by saying it's been a long journey for us at the World Resources Institute to really focus on this issue of environmental democracy through originally a lens of Principle 10, and then moving to look at regional approaches and then specific issues and issue areas, looking at environmental human rights defenders, looking at issues of politics and how that impacts the implementation of these rights. But I think what we still have is hope that this is a continued journey, and that our work can underscore continued assessment and monitoring of the implementation, but more so supporting local groups, coalitions, and civil society organizations within our network, but also outside, to really embrace the power that these rights signify and allow people to really influence government decision-making and corporate decision-making in the world to come. Thank you.
Thanks, Carol. That's fantastic, really impressive range of work going on at the Institute. We'll pick up some of these questions in the question and answer session. I imagine people will be interested to learn your kind of reflections on what you're learning from the different projects that you outlined for us. We'll hand over first of all to Daniel. Daniel, Carol obviously has been at the forefront of developing and trying to implement the environmental democracy agenda, giving us a flavor there of some of the areas of success, some of the areas where obstacles continue to be faced. Your work, in essence, puts that work within a broader framework of the changing relationship between democracy and climate agendas. And amongst other things that you've made, I think what for me is a vitally important issue that increasingly these look like two agendas that are kind of codependent or co-constituted. It's simply difficult to imagine today a successful set of democracy policies that fail systematically to implement a consideration of climate or environmental issues, and vice versa as well. It's difficult to think of really effective climate action without taking into consideration the imperative of political inclusion. So perhaps we give the floor to you and hear your reflections on this nexus question that we're discussing in this session.
Thank you very much, Richard. I will focus in my presentation on the question of, basically the question if climate, let me see, can I share the screen here, or is this, the question if democracy can deal with the challenges of climate change. And I'll base my presentation on the report that you mentioned, from the one I wrote for International IDEA, but it's basically going through some of the research on this issue over the last, say, 2 decades or so. So research looking at the level of democracy and climate policy performance, and I mean this relates to the wider question: is democracy contributing to a better environment? And I think if we start off with this question, I mean the discussion on democracy and environmental issues has been ongoing for quite some time, at least since the emergence of the modern environmental movements in the 60s. And there has been a tendency of like discussing whether these environmental challenges that we're facing are so complex that we need some kind of authoritarian responses, or if democracy can handle this issue. I mean, generally, a start off of the discussion over the last 2 decades, at least, could be to some extent said it started with a very interesting article in the Journal of Democracy by Roger Payne, where he said basically looking at experience of the socialistic regimes, the socialistic blocs, where the environmental degradation was quite eye-catching. Also, the experience of environmental groups being prevented to function in these authoritarian states prevented a quite clear, convincing case for democracy being better, or not only better, but even a prerequisite for environmental protection. So what he presents in this article is basically 5 general ideas why democracy performs better in climate or environmental aspects, where he focuses on freedom of media and freedom of information. You need a society, an open society, where people can share information and put emphasis to environmental degradation and how it relates to human needs and human development. Also, accountability mechanism, of course, and democracies being better in promoting international agreements and better distribution of wealth. So a few sort of theoretically convincing arguments for democracy being better in environmental merits. However, he mentioned in that article that there was a limited, the empirical basis for these arguments were quite limited at the time. There were not much research looking at the level of democracy development of democracy and climate environmental policy performances. Later, there were some studies showing that democracies is associated with better, say, aspect like soil degradation, limited local pollutions, to some extent also deforestation. However, when it came to climate policy performances, the empirical evidence were less convincing. And I would say from the time when this article was published, the year before, you know, that there was a ratification of the first international agreement on climate. So now we have at least 3 decades of experience showing how well democracies have been performing. And I think you can all agree that it's been inadequate. We quite far from meeting the sort of scientific agreed consensus of what needs to be done in order to prevent a climate crisis. Well, you could still ask yourself if democracies are performing better. So I was trying to go through most of the articles or the correlation analysis written on this, and I found some 40 peer-reviewed articles published over the last 2 or so decades. So what are the results? I'll just go through them very quickly. I think there's a slight majority of articles saying, yes, democracy has a significant effect on climate policy outcomes. So talking about in the aspects that yes, democracies are performing better in say, adopting regulations, establishing institutions for policy assessments and that kind of issues, or entering into international treaties and agreements. However, democracy has no significant effect on policy impacts, it should be here. So actually, if you look at emission reductions, I don't think the empirical evidence is convincing. There are, of course, some studies, but I think the most comprehensive studies are showing that democracies is not having a significantly convincing evidence that they are actually democracies, that the fact of democracy is leading to less emissions. And I think the main, so the bulk of the research would say, well, this issue is sort of, I mean, research is fairly inconsistent in what kind of answer we should give here. You could see that there are intervening variables. It's not democracy, which is the core aspect. It's the aspect of economic growth, which is, of course, mutually correlated with the democratic development. Democracies are generally developing with economic growth. Thus, with democratic development, you might have increasing emissions. So democracies are faced with the question, how can we keep welfare at a level where we decouple the economy from the carbon intensive aspect of our economy? Also, I think the research is quite convincing that the level of corruption is also an interfering variable. So yes, democracy can deliver even less emissions, but only if corruption is low. And I think this is it relates to what Carolyn said in the beginning, that you need to have governments that are capable to not only to present convincing policies, they also need to be able to enforce them and see to it that they diminish the implementation gap. This is, of course, related to fossil fuel dependency and fossil fuel policy capturing of fossil fuel industry, which I think science is quite convincing, saying that you can have a fairly functioning democracy, but not if you have a very influential fossil fuel industry. I think you have a few countries like USA, Canada, and Australia that show convincing cases for this. Also, there are a couple of studies showing that income equality is also quite important in order to have efficient climate policy performances. So I think the general conclusion of these kind of studies is, yes, democracy influences climate policy outputs, but has so far not had significant effects on emissions. And what you could say about this is, of course, climate policies are under development. All of the studies I've found only looked at emission data up to 2014. So they're actually not including emission data of post-Paris agreement. So if we can see, you need to have a democracy in order to present better policy output, laws, regulations. They would hopefully eventually lead to less emissions. So we might be in a situation where we sort of like in a it's too early to say, to assess the effects of democracy. Secondly, I think all of these studies are basically showing that yes, democracy has an impact. There's no evidence that I've found saying that less democracy, more autocratic responses would be more effective. You could make theoretically the argument that democracy is too slow, too much focused on short-term gains to please the electorate. But in general, I think the scientific, the sort of general scientific experience are not giving any evidence for that. And finally, I think since democracy is a factor of improving outputs, I think we should understand that developing and strengthening a democracy is part of the answer in order to accelerate effective climate policies for the future. I'll try to keep my presentation brief in order to allow the other ones speak, and I'll hope to respond to questions regarding this short presentation. Thanks.
Thanks, Daniel. It's a very rich paper and lots of very interesting analytical questions and nuances for us to examine and play with. It seems to me one perhaps clear conclusion is that if democracy is to have a positive impact on environmental policy, climate action, it has to be good quality democracy, that we still need to make more effort, invest more effort in improving the quality of democracy. Democracy in itself does not guarantee better climate action. It needs to be democracy that is responsive, that is not corrupt, that delivers on its promises. And as you suggest, the empirical data suggests that even if intuitively we may expect democracy to have many intrinsic advantages in delivering better climate policy, democracies themselves still need to deliver fully on that promise. So again, that reinforces perhaps the message that one cannot separate the need to work on deepening democracy, even as one works on trying to prompt and propel along effective environmental policy, which I think brings us to Alina, as someone who's been working on both the practical and the more analytical strands for many years. Alina has a very rich experience in academic work, but also in international organizations like the United Nations, in the private sector as well. She's been instrumental in setting up a very influential network looking at climate deliberation, climate assemblies at the moment. And crucially for our discussion here is leading some research that has been commissioned by the Westminster Foundation that tries to examine in detail how the environmental democracy approach is being implemented or not through development cooperation, and how this nexus might be made to work better in practice. I know it's an ongoing area of work, a very rich empirical series of researchers you've been leading, Alina. So we look forward to hearing your summary of this work. Over to you.
Thank you, Richard. And I think what I wanted to share with you builds very nicely on the discussions we had this morning as well, starting with keynote speeches and actually throughout the day. If we look at the issue of climate change in particular, but generally environmental degradation, those issues are, first of all, failures of governance, because the science is very clear. I think we also have technological solutions. I think economics has been also increasingly clear on the solutions that are available to climate change, yet we're not seeing the political response and the level of implementation that is necessary to address a crisis. So if we take that governance failure as a starting point, then effectively we start to unpack it. What are these governance failures related to? And some of them are related to the lack of information, so information gaps and uncertainties, which slow decision making. They also relate to the lack of, the need to actually improve longevity and resistance of policies to the political change over sectoral cycles. And that's where I think a lot of the principles of environmental democracy and the international agreements and declarations which were discussed throughout the day today really come into place. So I think regardless of the question whether democracy is what we essentially need to address environment, I think the real world we live in, and I think there is a lot of recent research coming up on that the democratic space is shrinking, and a large number of countries are essentially still autocracies. So what I've been looking at is how can we use the international agreements, the key principles of environmental democracy to actually advance implementation of climate change and environmental policies around the world, and what is the role of development cooperation and development aid in that process. And so when we started looking at that, basically there is a perception that donors and international finance in the climate space and environmental space in generally hasn't necessarily tackled this governance failure potentially to the extent that hasn't utilized the potential of integrating those two agendas. And so to understand it better, what we've done is we interviewed, in addition to reviewing literature and practical examples, we have held conversations with 20 foreign aid experts, including a staff of FCDO in the UK, but also professionals working in other donor agencies of other European countries, and also civil society experts involved on international aid in the democracy and environment space. And just today we're publishing the policy brief summarizing the briefings, but the full research will be available in May. And I want to share with you some highlights of those conversations, because I think they're very informative to understand what are the key barriers and why potentially this agenda hasn't had such an uptake around the world. The first finding, which was actually quite striking to me, both talking to climate and environment specialists and also to democracy community, that the concept of environmental democracy as such is very well understood in that community. I actually had a lot of people say to me up front that if you start unpacking it and talk about governance and talk about, this particular specific issues that we mentioned, the need to increase civil society participation, the need to improve the rule of law, then suddenly it starts to click. But when you say environmental democracy, that just basically didn't resonate immediately. And I think that is something as the kind of community of professionals working on this issue, we should really reflect on and see how can we frame the issue in a more effective way so that it's more easily understood and picked up by development professionals. Secondly, in terms of framing and knowledge, what we found is that there is a perception that the integration between two agendas, sort of governance, good governance, democratic transition, and environment and climate change at the institutional level remains a challenge. That in most cases, the governance teams would not be very well integrated with climate change teams and vice versa. And effectively, there was a feeling that we need more conversations like the ones we're having today and this week, bringing different communities together. But we also need, I think, from the academic community, better collection of evidence on how do these issues work together. Do we actually have examples like the ones Carol was mentioning in terms of projects that target governance, democratic transition, and key pillars of environmental democracy and climate and environmental objectives? Where have they worked? How have they worked? There is a feeling that we still don't have enough of that empirical information. So that is definitely an agenda that one needs to focus on. The other set of barriers which came up relate to funding strategies and cycles. And essentially, there are very few strategies. There is a feeling both on the side of, the other side of the Atlantic, but also in Europe, which actually make explicit link and explicit integration at the level of objectives for foreign aid programs, which would recognize this inherent link between, say, human rights, democratic transition, access to information and participation, and objectives of, reducing emissions, building resilience of the societies. One interesting best practice example which came up is actually in Sweden, and I think colleagues from the Swedish government will be presenting it later this week at the conference. Well, what their strategy essentially, especially strategy for Asia region, makes a specific link integrating all those priorities together. And talking to colleagues who actually implement the strategies, they said that actually makes a real difference in the way that they're working, at the practical level in the region. It allows them, it makes a stronger case for projects which actually cut across these areas. But the other important barrier, in addition to this lack of strategic integration, is actually short-termism, that it's not just in politics, but unfortunately also in the funding cycles. Increasingly, funding cycles are 1 year, maybe 2 years long. And as we know, governance programs, building capacity of legislators, of a parliament to actually draft climate law, conduct post-legislative scrutiny, building capacity of NGOs to effectively lobby for ambitious climate policies. It takes time. It's difficult to actually implement and see tangible change in a period of 1 and 2 years. And so that has been voiced pretty much by every single person I've spoken to, that is a huge challenge. And there are also some good examples on how to overcome it. Some colleagues from different embassies in the UK were sharing how they're using long-term theories of change, which you can actually build the longer-term theory of change on climate and environmental governance, and use that to structure your shorter-term kind of funding programs. And it's important to share those examples. And the feeling was that we potentially don't do enough of that yet. Another set of challenges and barriers which were highlighted, which I think are worthwhile picking up as we go throughout these 3 days, is challenges around measuring the governance change. And I'm really interested, maybe Carol would have some reflections later on from her projects, but what are the indicators that we could use to actually demonstrate that we have shifted some of this, essential parts of the political system. And it's quite difficult to attribute political change to a specific project. So it'll be interesting to see how different organizations are doing that. I think basically the feeling was that intuitively and also practically, a lot of development cooperation professionals, in particular working on climate change, they absolutely recognize the importance of governance and addressing some of these governance failures. But at the moment, you have to apply quite a bit of creativity to actually be able and introduce for example, programs working with parliaments or supporting inter-party parliamentary groups to strengthen their ability to introduce climate as part of their platforms. So this is quite a challenging area still. And I think on the 3rd day of the conference, there'll be a great discussion on that. But I think that is something also for academic experts, which I think there are a few of us on this panel. I think that is something that would be useful for us to pick up in future research. Now, let me talk about opportunities to address some of these barriers, which came up through our research. Well, first of all, I think we do have very good international legal basis for bringing these issues in a major way and a stronger way as part of the international development cooperation. And Principle 10 of the Rio Declaration, which was mentioned, the Aarhus Convention, Eskuzu Agreement, and also the Paris Agreement itself, which explicitly notes the importance of climate justice, public awareness, participation, transparency, and access to information. I think that's an excellent basis for introducing those concepts and forming projects that actually tackle these essential pillars of environmental democracy. The other opportunity actually, and that came up through a lot of conversations I had, is that oftentimes environmental democracy and climate and environment could actually be a great entry point to trigger a broader democratic transition in some of the countries which might not be inclined to explicitly talk about projects, foreign aid projects supporting democratic transition or strengthening of democracy. So it's indirect route to actually help the shrinking democratic space that we were discussing earlier on today. There are also some important opportunities in terms of launching dialogues like the one at this conference. And I think this is one of the recommendations we're making to policymakers, is to consider launching dialogues and joint action groups to exchange experiences and talk about challenges and best practices in the design and implementation of interdisciplinary projects which cut across governance, environmental, and climate priorities, and also gather evidence on how these projects and programs can deliver change in different political contexts. Another recommendations that we're making is that it's quite important to consider integrating objectives into development cooperation strategies in a more explicit way, kind of similar to what Sweden is doing. Look into their experience and consider explicitly stating and giving direction to different regional programs to consider climate justice, climate governance, human rights, and environmental crime and environmental objectives as part of the integrated agenda. And finally, what we have found is that at the country level, in specific embassies, there are quite a lot of examples and experience that has been collected. And so tapping into that experience as the overall strategies for foreign aid interventions are being developed is very important, and would really provide a strong basis for strengthening application of this joint objectives of governance, democratic transition, and environment and climate change together. So I'll stop there, but I'm happy to elaborate more in the discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Alina. And I'm sure people have further questions on the research you've been doing for WFD. So I think your summary very usefully leads our attention to some of the barriers that still need to be addressed: evidence, institutional coherence, funding cycles, analysis. They all seem to resonate very strongly. I happen to be calling in from Brussels. I work in a think tank here in Brussels, where one can see all those barriers that you mentioned being very strongly present within the EU institutions. We're actually just about to start an event in 45 minutes where we're trying to get the climate policymakers together with the democracy policymakers, who both probably see the intellectual case in working more systematically together, but find that their day-to-day remits just don't allow them to do that on a significant enough basis. So thank you for that. We'll come back to your projects in the questions and answers. Professor Lieberman, Evan, let's turn to you. We've had three very powerful normative cases for more commitment, more political will being invested in tightening up this nexus between environment and democracy policy. We had much the same in the first two sessions. Today, one would guess it's not as simple as that, and there are lots of political challenges and obstacles beyond simply stating commitment and political will. Where do you see the main kind of obstacles lying ahead in translating these kind of very powerful normative statements into practice, in making sure that climate and democracy policies are actually more interlocked effectively on the ground.
Great. Well, thanks for the opportunity to participate. Let me start. You mentioned this term political will, which one hears a lot about, and and all sorts of policy debates, whether it's on climate or in other issues. We'll talk about we need to find the political will. It's a bit of a catch-all phrase, something like commitment to invest resources and political capital in order to address the problem. And of course, there are lots of important leaders at all levels of government and non-government organizations who kind of have demonstrated, what we might call political will. But I'll say a few of my colleagues in the Evidence in Governance and Politics network were looking at the USAID draft strategy document, and as we read, mentions of this term, and we're thinking about its use in the climate discussions. Our recommendation was actually they should just eliminate the use of that phrase from the document altogether. And why do I say that? Because talking about political will of leaders as a solution in some ways obscures what I think a lot of the problems are, and makes us think a little bit less about what we can do to change the problems. And our recommendation was to replace that term with more language about incentives and motivation, right? In other words, let's not focus on political will as if it's simply kind of in the soul of some leaders and not others, but how to create that will to act. So, along those lines, and maybe I'm preaching to the converted on this panel to a degree, but I think a message that's useful more broadly is to take politics quite seriously. Of course, I'm a political scientist, but I think that a lot of people think about politics as almost a dirty word, and I realize I missed some of the earlier discussions because I was teaching about politics. So I'm not sure how much I'm going over what's already been said, but scientists at the forefront of sounding the alarm about the climate emergency have frequently taken the position that that climate should somehow be above politics, right? That if we just keep shouting louder about global threats, that governments and citizens are eventually going to step forward to act. But I think that's just not realistic, right? Because both leaders and citizens are political animals and face lots of competing demands and priorities. So, the question is that we need to ask ourselves, what types of information and what types of political pressure are needed to move those who are not yet committed to investing in mitigation and adaptation? And how do we make the reality of a rapidly changing climate more central to everyday governance? So, as we've talked about on this panel, we're talking about democracies, and in democracies, that means understanding how citizens and how organized interests come to understand the problem. And again, not just those who are already advocates for the climate, how to organize interests, perceive risk, and perceive the costs and the benefits of action. So again, about motivation. In terms of Daniel's presentation, I really appreciate that. I'm also kind of a democracy optimist, as I think probably all of us on the panel are, and that ultimately the best solutions to complex problems are well served by democratic institutions and by opportunities to hold governments accountable, including through elections, of course, which we haven't really talked about here too much. But clearly democracy is no panacea to complex problems, right? And we've seen that really vividly over the past 2 years with the response to COVID. Democracy's great benefit is the free flow of information, but that doesn't guarantee the accuracy of information, right? And more than that, people really have a variety of interests and perceptions, even when they have the same information, right? And even when they face the same objective dangers, their perceptions of risk and policy preferences might vary a lot. So for instance, we might say the changing climate affects all of us. And that's just as true as those who said that the AIDS pandemic affected all of us, or that COVID is affecting all of us, which is to say that some people are clearly much more vulnerable than others, and some are much better able to protect themselves privately and prefer to do that rather than to have governments intervene in a manner that might level the playing field. So I think we need to come to terms with those realities. So to be more specific about roadblocks, I'd say that the key ones are real and perceived differences and the degree to which citizens and government leaders perceive dangers from the climate emergency. And that when people see their interests as competing rather than shared, it creates real disincentives for political action. So that I think asks all of us to think about, how do we harmonize those interests? We can't just say that the dangers automatically harmonize the interests. There's something else that mediates that reality. And we should recognize that other things exacerbate conflicts within and across societies, right? And we've heard some of this on the panel, including from Carol. Ethnic, racial, national differences can be really important in both the realities and perceptions of vulnerability, and that can obscure a sense of common interest and cause a kind of mapping of climate-related problems onto other sorts of conflicts. So another problem is with respect to the ambiguity of who's responsible for what and the competing and overlapping governance structures that we might think of in a polycentric, governance framework. I've heard in this panel discussion about local governance all the way up to the EU and then to national governments. And we should just accept the fact that while even governments that are trying to act on climate might be in competition with one another and not partner effectively. And then the one other point I wanted to make at the moment is of course there's lots of competing problems that continue to take our collective focus off of climate. COVID, clearly one of them, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, another that we're facing. And those are real challenges. And so again, answering the question of roadblocks. So more than anything, I think it's inequality and an insufficient degree of solidarity across inequalities that are really challenging, even within the context of democracy. And it's going to take a lot of creativity to overcome those.
I just want to hear from your views on a couple of final points, Evan. But as we're drawing to a close, I just remind people that they can now submit questions. We just have some questions beginning to come in, as we will have quite some time to hear further from our speakers. Evan, it seems to me that the incentive structures you talk about hinge a lot on the distributional costs of energy transition, which perhaps links us to this whole issue of climate justice. There's obviously two very, very prominent concepts in our debates over recent years. One is environmental democracy that we're talking about in this session. The other one is climate justice. I just wonder how these actually relate together, and if your focus on these kind of incentive structures plays a role in that. I mean, is it somehow, can one imagine the democratic incentive structures that would actually enhance a focus on climate justice and demonstrate to us that climate justice is part of this democratic equation, it's part of providing that link between democracy and climate?
Yeah, it's a great question. Obviously, to a degree, it's a philosophical question, but as a practical question, I think the answer, which we'll have to see how it plays out in the years to come, is that kind of the goal of climate justice ought to be very much in line with the goals of kind of democratic justice. The climate emergency is clearly an existential threat, right? And the question for us as humans is, if we want to protect ourselves, what kind of society do we want? And so thinking about emerging ideas about climate justice, I think offers some important goalposts, and in turn, they're really quite linked to democratic practice. If we consider the recent IPCC report, it highlights three components or dimensions to climate justice, right? Distributive justice, that the burdens of costs and benefits should be relatively equal. Procedural justice, that there's fairness in decision making, and recognition, right, or respect and engagement with different groups and perspectives. On distributive justice, and really your question, pointed in this way was, democracy doesn't provide easy solutions, We know that many of the most unequal societies on the planet, including my own here in the United States, are democracies. So sometimes you can ask whether or not the US is fully democratic, but let's for the sake of argument, call it a democracy at the moment. You know, and as others have mentioned, certain business interests and other kind of climate backward perspectives can be influential. But at the very least, democracies offer opportunities for climate champions to be heard, including as coalitions that prioritize the interests of the poor. So in a world in which inequality is so profound, I do think democratic practice offers a vehicle for distributive justice. And the other two dimensions, I think democracy is critical, right? Democratization is essentially about the institutionalization of procedural justice. So I think that's critical. And I think that recognition is increasingly at the core of contemporary democratic practice, right? More modern democratic constitutions around the world, those of the past, the vintage of the past several decades, really reflect this value quite well, because previously so many groups had been excluded from decision making. And not surprisingly, they tend to be the ones that are the most vulnerable in the face of climate shocks. So whether, again, this is indigenous groups or other ethnic, racial, or national groups, now is really the time to make sure that those voices are heard. So not only do I think democracy is favorable for climate justice, but I think that because the climate emergency presents itself as the most important, most pressing set of problems of our time, I think democracies, to be sustainable, need to be seen as advancing climate justice, or those regimes just won't survive.
If I may, Evan, just one less philosophical question to finish on. How do you, as we've got people here leading such innovative research, and I mean, you have a long history in writing on these issues. I wonder if you have any reflections on Alina's point about the need for better analytical evidence and analytical ideas and innovation. What is it that the analytical community can bring to the table? Where are the knowledge gaps that you've detected in your experience?
Great. Well, it would take a long time to highlight all the knowledge gaps that are out there. There's a lot. I think there's been some good work on climate governance, but there's a lot to be done. There's so many pockets of the world that we haven't touched on. One of the points that I heard earlier in the panel was about involving communities. And I think researchers really need to see that nexus between governments and various types of communities, and to try to position themselves to observe that and be part of the democratic process in certain ways by making sure that they are speaking to one another. I was on a Zoom call yesterday with a remarkable individual from South Africa who's doing work on urban heat islands, right? And he said, the municipal government, recognized this problem, and they went in and they planted trees, right? Great idea. They went in and did it. Well, what happened? During the winter, the poor residents saw those trees as really great sources of wood for burning fires. And at the end of the winter, there were no more trees. There had been no consultation, and what seemed like a great idea to a bureaucrat, really, really backfired. And, in a sense, that lack of democratic participation is something that we need to take note of. We need to kind of reflect that back to various actors. The flip side, there was some great examples in Cape Town. So I'm giving you my South Africa experiences to maybe generalize for them. Many of you may know about the huge drought of a few years ago, where they almost approached what they were calling day zero. And I won't go into all the details, but one of the things that really struck me, you could talk about lots of failures in that case, but there were some enormous successes in communication strategies, in developing incentives, in leveraging peer pressure. And they not only averted day zero, but now a couple of years later, water consumption is like 50% less than what it was. And whole new systems have been adapted that also had the knock-on effect of conserving energy. Now, one of the great lessons from that case is that along the way, they were doing research, they were trying out new strategies, seeing what worked, and adapted. So I think that's really the big takeaway, at least the group that I'm working with, where we do a lot of work around experiments, the EGAP group, and don't start with the idea that there's going to be these great government blueprints and everyone's going to sit around and say, we know what's the right thing to do. We should all be humble, and we should say, we can't even anticipate some of the reactions and counter reactions. Let's try and develop some propositions. Let's try and think about what are the motivations of different actors, and how do those get set up in order to achieve key climate goals, and observe where those are implemented and where they're not. And just the way we would do a drug trial, in the places where these are implemented, do we have models of success that we can build on? So I think the key is to position ourselves as researchers in lots of different spaces where civil society and government actors can be working together, and to be able to try to leverage the power of experimentation at all levels and see if there are strong lessons that can be learned about what actually works. And again, in our research group, we've done this kind of multi-sited experimentation on other issues beyond climate. And sometimes we find, great ideas for various reasons, just like what I was telling you about with the, planting trees in a particular area without consultation, don't work. Let's learn about that before millions and maybe billions of dollars get spent on them, adjust and get it right, and then scale up. So I think that's the kind of research that we need to be doing, but we also need to figure out ways to disseminate our social and political research. I think that the climate scientists have done a better job of that. It's much harder for a lot of us who are in the social and behavioral realm to be able to aggregate all the information. I've already seen some comments, so some people say there hasn't been enough work done in some areas, and others will say, oh, there's been plenty. We just haven't been aggregating it well enough. So I think that combination of experimentation and aggregation are the key lessons that I hope people will take away.
I think it's also difficult for the democracy community to have that comparable degree of kind of clarity in its message that the climate community has been able to articulate. I think that's an excellent final point, that this the whole relationship between climate and democracy is going to evolve and look very path dependent, which one imagines reinforces the need for this ongoing research that WFD and others have been investing in. So thank you to our 4 speakers. We have about 20 minutes left for questions. I invite participants outside the panel to submit their questions and thoughts. We're lucky to have with us Rafael Jimenez, who leads WFD's work on this issue. Rafa, I don't know if you can or want to come in, or I can put some of your points to the speakers. If you can't come in, Rafa, I'll start off the conversation by putting 2 of your points to the panelists. Have one issue, one cluster of issues, both to Carol and Evan, that is to do with the evolution of politics in Africa. We heard in the previous session about the importance of regional agreements on climate, environmental issues, how vitally important these are, some of the political challenges in getting those regional agreements signed and implemented effectively. How does that regional agenda relate to what we've been talking here about more kind of local citizen engagement and democracy? Is the agenda of building democracy support, building more open and fair governance, compatible with the importance of these regional agreements that other people would see as being really the test case for progressing with climate policy? So it's a question both for Carol and Evan on Africa and what's happening in Africa. And then for Daniel and Alina, I have a question that I guess picks up on your point, Alina, about the sobering reality that outside a fairly niche community, the term of environmental democracy doesn't have that much of a resonance, which perhaps then begs the question that we have asked here on how do we fashion a message and a narrative that enables the democracy support community to kind of gain relevance and more dynamism on the back of the climate agenda, to overcome some of the limitations, Daniel, that you in your presentation and your paper identify. How can the democracy support community actually kind of take stock of the climate challenge to revitalize its own work in practice, not just in kind of abstract theory? Carol, do you want to pick up on the first question to do with kind of regional developments in Africa and how they relate to these democratic questions?
Sure. I'll first, maybe I'll jump on something that Evan said about not referencing political will and talking about political incentives. It's very interesting to see that even in Latin America, where I've been working for the last 10 years on a regional agreement, which we now have, the Eskuzu agreement, that the chief government that supported the Eskuzu agreement was Chile. And at the very end of the process, they made a decision that they weren't even going to sign the agreement because they changed government. The government changed. And the new government, which had actually been the same government that started the process, now came back into power after many years and decided it was not going to have anything to do with that. So there is a need to look at what incentives exist. And in that case, there was quite a huge push by corporate lobbyists not to go ahead and have anything to do with the Eskuzu agreement anymore. And so it was really interesting to really understand what are some of the incentives to create a kind of force will for legal reform and to embrace the issue and the principles of environmental democracy. Very recently, I don't know if you've seen in the news that Chile has now put forward to their Congress that they will sign the Eskuzu agreement most recently, but it's really, really striking how even after working on a process for so long, that government that championed it, withdrew because of the influence and the power of certain lobbyists to influence their final decision on abiding by it. And at least it taught me a lesson in one way, because I've heard from many of the groups we work with in Chile that it wasn't until Chile decided not to sign the agreement that there was a huge demand and a movement in Chile for the government to change their mind and actually understand what the Eskuzu agreement was and what environmental democracy was and why there was a need to fight for it. So yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. But to move to Africa, we've recognized for many years that there needs to be a push for these issues to actually be prioritized by government. Many of the panelists mentioned issues like corruption and undue influence by certain sectors of society, and there's things within our democracies that actually act against us being able to move forward with people's will actually being put into law and practice. And that's why there's been a focus on regional frameworks, a space to focus government's attention, to understand what are some of the capacity to gaps, to find new funding to bring to the table, to find spaces for civil society to be able to engage their governments in new forums that can create kind of an understanding of some of the tension points that exist around, or conflict-ridden areas that exist around environment and development and climate, definitely climate, exploitation of minerals, oil, fracking, all of these issues. There are tension points across the world on these issues. And there are not as many spaces to actually address people's complaint that they're effectively not allowed to influence final decisions. And so that's why I think it's really has been critical for us also to think about Africa as the next region that these sorts of considerations need to be brought to. We just finalized some research, and it was clear to us that even though there's been progress in laws that recognize these principles relating to environmental democracy, still people who raise their voice to protest against exploitation of oil or a new pipeline are jailed, or they are attacked or stigmatized or criminalized. Recently in Uganda, I believe it was 2 lawyers have been criminalized for their work on a pipeline, the East Africa pipeline. So they're not safe spaces for people to be able to raise their voice to actually say they don't agree with the environmental decision making that's made. In that case, it could also be considered climate decision making. And so there are also weak institutions. There are not political incentives to actually address this issue and create safe spaces for people to participate and their decision to actually influence. And there's not even sufficient public awareness of these rights and how to use them across Africa. And the model of the Eskuzu Agreement really provides an interesting bottom-up framework for change, where civil society really was the one that demanded that we want you to focus on this issue of environmental democracy. And the big question is whether or not there are feasibility, new pathways to have this issue raised across Africa, with certain governments leading in this array to be able to say that, yes, we think it's time for us to really understand how we reduce conflicts, how we address these issues of conflict around development projects or policies, how we create a just transition, looking at even the green minerals that need to be, extracted for this green, revolution, addressing climate change. A lot of that is looking at Africa, which has so many natural resources that people are looking at actually trying to exploit. But how can you do it in a fair way that doesn't actually continue to have a huge impact on the communities that are around these developments or impacted by these developments? Or are there ways to ensure that there are more incentives to protect forests and not destroy them? And how do you create that? And we believe it has to come through empowering local communities and citizens to have safe spaces to influence the decision. And it's one of the few means that fights against corruption and lobbyists, is to have citizens to have more power in these spaces. So that's why a focus on Africa, we think, is so important. And that it's one way for us to really look at also improving democratic practices through a lens of environmental democracy or even climate democracy. Because just on its own, speaking about elections or lobby rules, we don't think is as convincing to get reforms easily, but we think that there is an avenue through environmental or climate democracy to try and get some of those reforms that are needed. Thanks.
Evan?
Yeah, I'll just add briefly. I think that there's nothing wrong with regional agreements, but along the lines, I think in the same vein that Carol's arguing, really where the action is at is from below. With citizens and civil society, and the views and attitudes are not fully formed. Again, other conversations I had, even again in the case of South Africa, people are telling me, well, in a lot of local communities, you ask them what they're concerned about. Well, climate is not on people's minds, but what is on people's minds are social development outcomes that are related to climate that they're not thinking about necessarily in climate terms. I think that that's really the fundamental issue at the moment in Africa is adaptation. We recognize that there are a lot of resources that need to be protected. There's a lot of drilling for oil that's going on that is problematic for the larger problem of carbon output eventually. But I think that fundamentally adaptation is the issue that faces most of Africa. And the regional agreements, for the most part, in terms of what we know about politics, they're just, on other issues, they don't have that much bite. They don't have that much bite internationally, but definitely in Africa, they really don't have that much bite. So rather than thinking about from above, I think about the change coming more from below.
Which I guess links onto the question that was put to you, Daniel and Alina, of how the democracy support community might be able to draw energy from the fact that the climate agenda seems to be picking up traction. But obviously there's so much money going into adaptation at the minute. One wonders how democracy-related components might be built more systematically into those kind of initiatives. Alina, do you want to have a first go at this? Then we'll
Sure, and thank you. I think that actually came through in some of the conversation I had, is that, you know, it is an opportunity. I think it's both an opportunity and an imperative actually that we do that, because if you fail to consider governance related issues in a technocratic environmental or climate program, it's unlikely that that program would be successful. And at the same time, due to quite significant amount of funds now being directed to climate change, it's definitely, I think, is an opportunity to support some of that transition and some of that strengthening of democratic pillars. And I think I wanted to link to the question you posed a few minutes ago to us in terms of reframing if the concept of environmental democracy is not that very well understood in the climate community. My feeling is that what is an effective way forward is actually unpacking it and talking about the pillars, talking about the substance of what we mean. We mean, you know, increasing access, well, producing quality information, credible information, and making it transparent and accessible. We mean empowering communities, empowering citizens. And I think one, just linking maybe to what Evan talked earlier in his remarks, one of the important features of democratic societies is deliberative aspect. And I think what is really striking, looking at the climate assemblies and climate juries, for example, around the world, oftentimes in the climate community, you hear the view climate is a very complex issue. It's an issue for experts. You can't leave it to citizens to actually decide on what the policy should be. And sometimes you have a fear that if you put it to a citizens assembly, you might get you know, citizens deciding on low levels of ambition because they come from different walks of life, different interests, and some of them are frankly not supportive of ambitious climate action. But what the actual experience shows that given the information, give citizens information through experts, give them an opportunity to discuss. And every single climate assembly, I think today, it came up with more ambitious recommendations than what the government thought was possible or was what would have support. And so I think that's one powerful feature of democracy and democratic, well, environmental democracy, this deliberative aspect of it. And so I think if you put the climate community, there's very specific elements of environmental democracy that should be addressed in climate programs. I think that's when it becomes starts to stick and starts to make sense. So public awareness, participation, transparency, access to justice, and environmental legislation, and actually strengthening implementation of climate laws through you know, trainings to judges, trainings to parliaments, collaboration among parliaments. And we do have successful examples. I just think we need to share more experiences on that, and also make sure that this is built into climate programs at the strategic level, not as an afterthought or not as a creative kind of attempts by a few embassies or few organizations to actually go into that space. Thank you.
Do you agree with that, Daniel? Are they all useful entry points?
Oh yes, I think, as you mentioned, and I think some of even and Carol, you mentioned this as well. If you're gonna implement some kind of climate policy at local level, you need to involve the communities in order to build legitimacy for it, because otherwise you will not have. I mean, you would not be able to understand all the parameters involved, and you won't be able to have some kind of sustaining policy. And I think it's been mentioned. I mean, the climate change is a challenge of great complexity. We can, you know, there are some parts of the climate movement is constantly saying, listen to the scientists, but obviously, when it comes to climate science, is of course there's a strong consensus on the basic issues of what's causing global warming. But when it comes to responding to it, there is, it's a fairly high degree of uncertainty of what's the most efficient responses, and also there's since it's a complex issue, which is basically relating to everything in society. It's for whatever response you will have, you're going to have different kind of social, economic, cultural and even ecological consequences. So I think that is the most convincing argument for democracy. If you're gonna implement things on top, top down, you will have consequences that you haven't foreseen from the start. So first of all, involving a wider range of community and being able to have information flowing from the bottom to the top is necessary if you're going to have effective climate policies. And also, I think we are in a learning process. We don't understand all fully how we're going to, craft the most effective responses. So we need to have a system that can evaluate and assess and sort of readjust the policies that we present. And I think what it takes is, of course, independent institutions like, climate councils and that kind of policy institutions that can assess. But I mean, the most effective institutions here are civil society organization expressing their concerns about issues and so on. And I think this is not only theoretical arguments that I'm making. I think there's quite a lot of empirical basis to this, and I'm presenting one in my paper on the Chinese energy policy. I mean, China has been rewarded for being so effective in installing wind power. However, they've been more effective in installing wind power than, for instance, United States. However, the output of the energy in the energy system has been extremely low. Why? Because the energy policy is a quite complex. It's a complex segment of policy making. You need to know where you need to combine the energy system. Where is the demand? How is this going to be? And also, if you don't have local communities or local authorities ready to implement your policy that you're presenting, you won't have an efficient policy. So this is one thing. And also connected this. I mean, this is related to the discussion on wicked problems. I mean, all the sort of negative consequences that are unforeseen by sponsors. But I think also we need to mention wicked problems are also wicked opportunities, because as soon as you start to implement climate policy, you can also have a lot of unforeseen positive responses. Shifting to electric vehicles would save millions of lives. As soon as you start to implement renewable energy, you could actually create a source of income for local communities if you do it in the right way. So I think we need to understand the complexity and the interconnectivity of societies, and in understanding that, seeing how that interconnectivity can be used in order to empower local communities. So if you can have that holistic understanding of this issue, I think we'll be able to both speed up and make the transition more legible. So I would say, focus on the wickedness in a positive and a more problematic sense.
It's been a message from that. Okay. Great advice. Thank you to the four of you. We have run out of time. I do offer apologies to Petra Alderman, who submitted a very good question on the circular economy and made that. I mean, it was a question to all of you, but I think she's making a very pertinent point that there is a slight danger there that the circular economy concept that has become so dominant should be taken with some care, if at least a situation where business and vested economic interests are able to hijack the kind of citizen participation we've been discussing in this panel. So great point, Petra. I've learned from the four of you that there's a lot of very innovative and interesting work going on the ground to flesh out the substance of what we mean by environmental democracy and take it forward into a new phase, and some of the broader analytical debates need still to feed into that on the groundwork, given that the kind of aggregate relationship between climate and democracy is still very uncertain and evolving in very important ways. To pick up on a comment that Anthony Smith has left us with in concluding, that you can all see submitted, I would suggest that one clear lesson is that we need to close the gap between the democracy support community and policymakers sitting on a lot of additional capacity now dealing with climate issues in both directions. If, as Anthony says, democracy support needs to learn how to address climate and other kind of real life issues to much greater effect than it's done so far. Probably the link needs to be made the other way around as well, with huge amounts of climate funding now available. The politics of that, as Evan talked to us about, needs to be built in. And for those people, to that community, to recognize that adaptation and the like cannot just be technical solutions, but to really get to the heart of the politics of how transition is taken forward. So with that, thank you to the 4 speakers. Thanks to WFD for putting this on. We close there.